A surveillance technology expert says Hong Kong protesters are right to fear state surveillance with the announcement of a ban on wearing face masks. But Ray Walsh of watchdog group ProPrivacy says the use of video recorded by protesters themselves may also be used against them. The city has experienced 18 weeks of protests, initially sparked by plans for an extradition treaty with China. The protests continued even after the plans were abandoned, with a list of pro-democracy demands, including an investigation into the police response to the protests, among them. Things ramped up when Hong Kong's Chief Executive Carrie Lam used an emergency regulations ordinance not used for half a century to pass a law banning the wearing of face masks at public gatherings. Protesters have been wearing masks to combat the use of tear gas, water cannons and rubber bullets by police, but also out of fears about the use of surveillance technology. Ray Walsh is a researcher and journalist with ProPrivacy.com and says the demonstrators are right to be concerned. Ray, thanks for being with us.
Sure.
First, on the level of surveillance technology being used in Hong Kong right now, is it the sort of CCTV cameras and other mechanisms that we see in most cities, or is it more advanced?
Okay, so what we know is that the authorities have been using footage from CCTV cameras, which is taken from the media, and footage taken from social media, in order to identify protesters who are of interest to the police. On the one hand, we have got confirmed reports of manual techniques being used by the police in order to cross-reference faces against social media accounts, to attempt to find suspects that have been involved in the non-peaceful elements of the protest. And on the other hand, we have reports of Hong Kong protesters having pulled down smart lampposts that are suspected of being able to capture people's faces. And while the government claims that those monitoring towers aren't being used for the purposes of identifying protesters, there seems to be plenty of reason to question that kind of response from the authorities.
Being?
Well, basically, because the protesters know that those cameras were installed by a Chinese company, they actually suspect that it's possible that footage could be held by those cameras and then forwarded to China at some point, either now or in future. And even though it would appear that the protesters have actually won what they wanted, originally they were fighting, obviously, to have this extradition law be taken away, and actually that now appears to be happening. So for the protesters, it really comes down to the potential that even though they appear to have won now, this sort of law could come back in the future. And if it does, then there's always the potential that any footage that has been taken by these cameras could be used to prosecute them at some point in the future, because facial recognition technology the actual algorithms don't need to be present in the smart lampposts for any footage taken from those smart lampposts to be used in the future alongside those technologies in order to identify people that were participating in the protests.
So the potential is there. You're not saying it's being used yet, but the potential is there, given the technology that's installed for other purposes, for monitoring traffic and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly, if it's thumbnail, because what it is that the cameras themselves, they're up on these lampposts and they're able to spot, they're mainly used for monitoring traffic, and they're able to spot number plates from that distance. So it doesn't seem a stretch of the imagination to imagine that those cameras can also, spot people's faces. And even though the technology isn't necessarily being used for those purposes at the moment, the footage that's being taken, because the people are protesting right in the middle of the street, there is the potential for that footage to later be taken and to be fed to algorithms, which then spot any faces and then cross-reference those faces against existing databases. And because we are talking about an extradition law, which even if it goes away now, it could come back in a year, it could come back in 2 years, it could come back in 5 years. And if it does, the protesters have reason to fear that China could indeed use the faces. And because the extradition law actually does specifically deal with potential criminals that could be sent back to China without having to go through the courts, if the law was ever reintroduced, then people have the right to fear that that technology could be used against them.
What you're saying is the technology is absolutely there now for facial recognition, sophisticated facial recognition analysis. The thing is, with the existing situation, most CCTV cameras, and again, I'm interested in the technology, as I understand it, most of them end up wiping their contents because there's only so much they can handle, right? So, thousands and thousands of hours becoming hundreds of thousands of hours. Is there the possibility at the moment that in the 18-week period of the protests, something different has been happening? And could we know that? Is this precisely what the protesters fear?
Sure. Well, the protesters fear that the fact that the government wants them to take off these masks is obviously inspiring the belief that their faces need to be monitored. And that is what's raising the fear that perhaps these cameras are being used for more nefarious purposes than have been admitted. And even if the Hong Kong government claims not to be using those technologies in the way that they fear, because these technologies were installed by a Chinese manufacturer who was directly involved in setting up China's, very far-reaching surveillance network, and the people fear that, just like in America, they fear that Huawei 5G technology could have backdoors in it. People fear that there's potential for those Chinese technologies to actually be sending data back to China. And while you say yes, that CCTV footage gets deleted, if the footage was being taken for the interest of holding on to it in order to potentially use it in the future, then it's not going to be deleted. It's going to be held onto, and it's going to be used as and when the potential to use it comes up.
I guess the difference between the concerns about Huawei in the United States, and we've well covered those, Huawei in Australia, Huawei in New Zealand, the difference here is that, of course, this is a territory now handed back ultimately to China from its previous colonial master, Britain. So it's already in a different zone. This is the point of the whole pro-democracy movement. It's about the future of Hong Kong, whether the one country, two states model holds with the democratic, quasi-democratic rights that the territory's been used to. That would give reason for an elevated concern, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And the government in Hong Kong is now discussing the potential for internet blocks to be used in order to stop protesters from being able to coordinate and mobilise. And the admission that it wouldn't even rule out the potential of asking China for help with dealing with these protesters is giving Hong Kong even more reasons to fear that the government is mimicking exactly the kind of totalitarian Chinese policies that Hong Kong citizens are united against.
You also warn that the footage that the protesters themselves have taken and used, is this for social media purposes, puts them at risk?
Sure, because a lot of the frontline protesters have been wearing gas masks with actually GoPros on the front. And while their intention is to catch police who have been taking their badges off, police involved in what is considered to be, undue force, there is also the potential for them to film each other and to catch each other doing things in the heat of the moment, which can then come back to bite them in the bum. So, some of that footage is going to be potentially useful, and it's not all about facial recognition. When it comes down to it, manual techniques of just going through the footage, asking people to come forward when they know who somebody is going to be enough for the police to certainly, do police work.
Thank you very much, Ray Walsh from the watchdog, privacy watchdog, ProPrivacy.com, speaking about the situation in Hong Kong right now, where, as we've just discussed, of course, an ancient law or 100-year-old provision enabled the use of emergency powers by passing laws, and it was invoked for the first time, I think, in over 50 years, and certainly for the first time since Hong Kong was returned to Chinese oversight. So quite dramatic developments in the last few days that have led to a outbreak again of violence